Hey there, gang. This is a nice Gibson Les Paul Custom from 1990. It's in here because of a kind of unusual problem. The owner finds it very uncomfortable to play because the binding along each side of the neck has been damaged. What I think has happened is this was given a refret some years ago by someone who was anxious to retain the little nubs at the ends of the frets. We've talked about these before. This is sort of a Gibson idiosyncrasy. On higher end models, they like to install the frets and then bind the board afterwards, leaving the plastic high, and then they remove the bulk of it between the frets just to leave these small plastic outcroppings on the ends. It's time-consuming work, but it can look very nice when the guitar is new. However, they are prone to damage if you don't look after them. Occasionally they'll separate slightly, enough that you can catch the high E string in the gap. This is mild. In worst case scenarios, you'll be playing a solo in front of a large crowd and the E string will get stuck in there and you'll have to stop and pull it out. So they kind of reduce the effective playing width of the fret because of that. And if the time arises when a refret is necessary, it brings up this terrible question. So what do you want to do about the nubs? It's possible to remove frets and make new ones that fit precisely in the space left behind. Does it seem like that might be agonizing, slow, time-consuming work? Oh, you betcha. Repair people hate that job. And to be honest, most customers can be convinced that it makes more sense to just file off the nubs and carry the new fret full width over the binding. It's the same thing to do, unless you're working on a 1959 Les Paul Standard, in which case the budget is obviously as high as it needs to go, and you can spend a month doing that and make sure everything's perfect. In this case, I guess they had to make it difficult. There's one little wrinkle, and that is those nubbins, they can be coaxed to spread outwards just a little ways, a couple thousandths, if the fret is maybe slightly over-radiused when it's installed. However, the tang of the fret below, if that's long and extends past the edge of the fingerboard, it can do considerable damage. The forces involved can split the binding. Usually it's hairline cracks, but sometimes big sections can blow out. Or perhaps the work is being done when it's extremely humid. The guitar is basically soaking wet. It's swelled up. Things look great until December rolls around and then the neck shrinks in width. Pow. Those frets can't shrink and they act like little battering rams and damage results. So that's tip one. If you're a repair person inclined to do a between the nibs job, treat the ends of those frets as if they were being installed over binding, like a regular bound refret. You grab your nippers and you take off 1 millimeter from both sides. You know the drill, because you've done a lot of fret work before you've even thought of taking on a job like this. And even if things fit perfectly on that day, this is insurance, because if this was to happen down the road, you might consider it warranty repair because you want to do right by your customer. But a lot of times they're not going to come back to you, because they already paid how much for that fret job, and this was the result, and don't know about that guy. So tip two, it's actually much easier to sneak up on a perfect fit if you're just removing a tiny amount from the ends of the crown, rather than having the tang in the way. So it'll be faster and easier if you take the extra minute to nip the tangs. And players, recognize that if you find someone willing to do this kind of work, it really is upper echelon stuff. Because ostensibly you're having the refret done to make playing easier, and retaining the nibs does not necessarily do that. But if keeping them for originality's sake is that important to you, maybe don't get it done. Maybe it's time to put it in the display case, because there's like 10 people in the world who can do it really, really well on their best day. These guitars were not designed to be refretted like this. Most of the ones I've seen do end up with some issues down the road. Be warned. I've been looking at this thing for a couple of days now, going back and forth, trying to figure out the best way to handle it. This was one of those instances of remote communication where it's difficult to really get a sense of how bad something is until you get your hands on it. My first inclination was that I was going to do a fill. I could mix up some celluloid binding shavings and acetone and produce some goop and then spread it all over there and just go to town with it before sanding it all off. Looking at it now, though, every single fret end on both sides is affected, And the missing chunks are seriously deep, and it's all cracked. So now I'm thinking it's probably best to go ahead and rebind both sides of this neck, because in the end it'll probably take the same amount of time if I fill it, and we'll hopefully end up with a cleaner result. But you know, there can be pitfalls, and I'm wary because I'm going to have to cut through the lacquer to free the bottom up, and that means I'm going to be putting more finish on. I'm going to have to do some touch up. It's also the middle of summer, and even though I've got my dehumidifier chugging away, keeping things acceptable in here, I kind of wish it was really, really dry so I could see just how far those fret ends protrude on a bad day. Because when I get the binding off here, it'll probably be flush or even sunk. So, you know, such is life though. I just got to do my best with what we're working with. The truss rod pocket is pretty clean, and the nut has lots of available thread on it. I'm checking this out because this thing has had a neck break. Surprise, surprise. Which was repaired and sprayed over. You can see there is some slight sinkage there in the line of the crack. But on the whole it looks okay. There are also slight witness lines between the new lacquer and the old. But it's holding. Let's talk about why this is bound to be messy. It seems like a simple thing. You just peel the binding off, put a new one on, right? No problem. The thing is, this junction you see between binding and neck, that's an illusion. Well, it's all an illusion, man, but in this case the binding extends for some distance below that black lacquer. It gets sprayed over top after it's been masked off, and it's scraped for a nice clean line. And I'm going to make some relief cuts with a scalpel, but no matter what I do, this lacquer is chippy enough that I'm going to lose some in places I'd rather I didn't lose it. Probably end up seeing spots of raw mahogany, chips and stuff. This binding itself might be the ABS kind with the little tongue in the back that fits into a groove on the side of the fretboard. It's nasty stuff. Even being careful, little pieces of wood can come up with it. So I'm saying this is going to look really ugly before it gets better. There's got to be finished touch-up and clear coats. And at some point I'll probably holler at myself that this wasn't worth it. But then, you know, eventually it'll start to look good again and I'll regain my composure. I'm using a scalpel to score the lacquer down around where the actual intersection between binding and neck is. Yeah, I can see the black lacquer is just flaking right off. Yeah, you can see this stuff is sort of T-shaped. It's got the tongue and groove I was talking about. This style of binding doesn't like to peel away very easily. The tongue is a snug fit in the groove, and if I try and pry it up, it will take wood away with it. So I'm resorting to slicing it free. Now I'm squaring up the channel with a fine safe edge file. The ends of the fret tang protrude about 13/1000ths of an inch, which is like 0.3 millimeters. So this neck did shrink after they were installed. Here I'm bringing those tang ends back flush with the edge of the board. The remnants of the old binding down in the groove there, I'm not going to worry about because they're firmly entrenched, and if I pull them out, I'm just going to have to plug it with something else anyway to give me maximum surface area for gluing. Here's the new binding. It's starting off at 1/16 of an inch or 1.5 millimeters wide, which is slightly wider than the channel in which it's going to go. But I need that extra room to sculpt the curve because the neck profile isn't a right angle where the binding starts, and it's slightly taller than the frets for obvious reasons. I'm just cutting the strip to length here and making a nice right angle on the end where it will butt up against the pickup ring. Once again, I'm going to make a small 45-degree chamfer on the inside corner of the binding. This will help in the very likely case that there's some junk down in the corner of the channel, or maybe it's not perfectly square at this point. It's kind of like what they call an engineering corner. I'll also rough up the gluing surface with some coarse sandpaper to give the glue something to really get a grip on. I'm using CA glue again for this one. I've had good success with it. The solvent-based glue can really mess up the lacquer, especially if you're going to tape things in place because it squeezes out under the tape and it melts everything. Plus, it's not that easy to buy here in Canada. The luthier suppliers can't ship it because it's hazardous. And also it'll give you brain damage if you huff too much of it, so I try to limit my exposure. I think I'd rather have the glue fail on a joint like this than break the binding again if there are similar problems in the future. As for longevity, the American Association of Art Conservation considers this stuff archival safe, so if it's good enough for the Smithsonian, I feel okay using it. I use medium viscosity glue, and I work on a short section at any one time. I press it in place and then hold it with tape. Over the body it's difficult to clamp, so I just press it for a couple of minutes. Gives me a chance to think some deep thoughts. With the strips in place, I'll come back from the top with some thin viscosity CA and wick that into the corner to make doubly sure. I'll also put a drop on each fret end as I go along. The trick now is to bring the level of the binding down to the surface of the fingerboard while retaining a piece at the end of each fret. I chop down with the razor blade here. Guided by the side of the fret, it makes a mark, sort of a convenient stopping place while I'm scraping. And using the same razor blade, I go back and forth between those marks. Sometimes I'll use a chisel to remove more of the waste quickly, and something like a coarse file also works well for this. As I get close to the surface, I make another blade with safe corners. I put a piece of Scotch tape on them so they won't mar the board. With the notches done, I think it's time to blend the binding into the shape of the neck. I do this with a large sanding block to keep things straight. The shape of the neck curls up and sort of inwards at the top. It kicks back a little. This is the easiest way I've found of doing that. Over the body, it's a little more difficult, of course. I use my safe edge file, and I've got a couple of layers of tape on the top surface of the body, and I'll get in there with a little scraper as well. Pare down some of the excess material I left around the ends of the frets. Then I'll use a safe edge fret end file to work on bringing the plastic flush and beveling it to match what's on the fret. This is sort of preliminary work. A certain amount of this will be done afterwards using abrasives when I recrown the frets. Be certain to hold on to some of the shavings here because they're useful if you can come up with a prank that involves shredded coconut. Using a standard fret crowning file, it's helpful to work from both sides to blend the nub in, and putting pressure against it also checks to make sure that the nub is bonded and there are no gaps between it and the fret. I did some recrowning on some of the frets and then cleaned up the top surface on all of them. Here I'm using micro mesh. This helps, again, blend the surface of the nub in with the fret. I need to gently round over the edge of the binding so that it will feel comfortable and won't slice your fingers up. This is some 220 grit paper stuck to an old steel ruler, which works pretty well. Then I have to make a thinner stick that fits between the frets and the upper register. Before I can spray new lacquer on, I need to scuff sand the old surface so it's ready to accept it. I'll mask off the fingerboard with standard painter's tape. This works okay. If you can get your hands on some automotive masking tape, that works even better, but it does seem to have a shelf life, so unless you're finishing constantly, you end up using like 3 feet out of a 100-foot roll and writing off the rest. I'm going to mix up some black lacquer here. I want this very opaque, so there's quite a lot of dye in it. It's dark, but it's liquid. There's proportionally a lot of thinner in this, so it acts like its own flash coat and sticks well. So I load that in the airbrush and go to town with a camera that isn't auto-focusing. Sorry about that. A couple of coats and then I'll peel off the tape. I don't want to leave it in place for too long. This cuts down on the tendency for it to flake at the edges. There's always going to be a bit of fuzzy stuff that needs to be scraped clean. Gibson used to have some real artists on staff who did a phenomenal job of scraping. Just, don't drink a coffee that morning and be careful. Use your own fingers as a guide, like a fence against the fingerboard, and just scrape it back ever so gently. And try to keep things reasonably straight. Though even in factory instruments you sometimes find lines that curl a bit. I'll measure for the side dot markers, Gibson uses almost absurdly large plastic rod for this. I usually like 1/16 of an inch dots. They use 3/32. It's like 2.5 millimeters-ish. So I drill those just through the binding. Over the body I need to use the extra long aircraft installer's bit to reach. Glue in the rods, cut them flush, sand them a little bit. Have to do some black touch-up on that little piece that came off there right beside the dot. And then I'll mix up an aging formula. The binding, of course, has got lacquer on it that was probably tinted slightly at the factory, but is also yellowed with age. So I put a little bit of amber in the lacquer. It's also slightly grayish in tone as well, so I added just a tiny dot of black, just to take off that glaring newness, that stark white color. Then I need to lightly sand again before putting on clear coats. This is also a good time to fill any dips or defects. I found a couple on the back of the neck here. Put some super glue in those and I'll scrape and sand them flat again before putting on the clear lacquer. Time to carefully peel off the masking tape that's been on the fretboard this whole time. I'll lightly wet sand to try and get rid of any orange peel or surface irregularities. I use 1000, 1200, and 2400 grit papers for this. This is after letting the lacquer cure for a couple of weeks. The longer you wait before level sanding, the better, and this being a particularly humid summer, it takes longer for the lacquer to really cure up hard enough to take a shine. Then I use medium and fine automotive polishing compounds to get it glossy. I do this by hand. Doesn't take very long. So we're left with a neck that has nubs, and it looks kind of like it's been played for 30 years. It no longer has the cheese grater effect on your thumb and your palm, so that's a good thing. I gotta be honest, these jobs are really quite annoying. They take a lot of effort to get not a whole lot of wow factor, but I'm reasonably satisfied with it. Let's plug it in and see what it does.